Greetings. I'm Adipurwawidjana, and I'm here on behalf of myself and my colleague Indra Sarathan of Universitas Padjadjaran to present our tentative findings on our preliminary study of the intertwining of the issues of gender and ethnic identities as represented in periodicals in early 20th century West Indies. Popular periodicals produced by the ethnic publishers in the Dutch Indies in the 1920s and 1930s, such as Hwapo of Semarang, Hwapit of Padang, and Penghibur of Palembang, present voices of young women, the so-called Sotjias of the time, calling for greater freedom. This study shows that the process in which gender roles are being worked out also requires that ideas about Chinese identity are also redefined while considering such cultural problems as modernization, national identity, gender equality, and political independence. In general, we are focusing our attention on the materials present in three periodicals, namely Hwapo, published in Semarang in the early 1920s, Hwapit, published in Padang beginning in 1927, and Penghibur, published all through the 1930s and 40s. All three were run by ethnic Chinese or publishers of Chinese descent. The majority of the materials, especially in the first two, are written by ethnic Chinese writers also. In January 1923 issue of Hwapo, literally Chinese Daily, in the section entitled Suara Kaum Perempuan, or the Voices of Women, a young woman of Jember makes a very bold call to women of her time. She says that, sisters, wake you up from your sleep. Muster all the power you can, break those ropes that tie your hands, feet, and bodies, and stand equal to men in this world. She calls on women in general, then in the next sentence she compares the condition of women of Java to that of her sisters in China and the West, who says we're fortunate in that they have equal rights and no longer suffer the oppression of men. In the following issue of Hwapo, Peck Hyang, referring to Hans and Cha's pieces, continues the discourse by saying how urgent it was that women received education in order that the disadvantageous conditions that the previous two young women have lamented about. What Han, Chia, and Peck address is related to the traditional values held by the Chinese community, which they held as a means to preserve their identity in diaspora. The article by Sin Pit in Hua Pit shows the keepers of the Chinese tradition were anxious about the diminishing of how, or filial piety, or respect of elders and tradition, which seemed to have occurred due to the social changes coming from the West, bringing modernity, but at the same time pose a threat to the ethno-national identity of the Chinese community. The theme of the dangers of Western influence on Chinese lives in the Indies are often explicitly shown in tragic love stories, such as a novel entitled Nona Chuyu, atau percintaan yang membawa cilaka, or a love affair that brings disaster, by the writer Tio Isui, a very prolific writer, published in 1922. And also Pendidikan yang Keliru, or A Wrong Education, a play in 5 acts by Lau Gioklan, published in 1922. And also, for example, Rahasia Bandung, or The Bandung Secret, by a pseudonym Chabano, published in 1917, actually, right before, and has been reprinted and republished by the publishing house Ultimus of Bandung in 2016, with the initiative of Komunitas Alit in Bandung, a group which concerns itself with the history of Bandung. Now, however, this concern in the early 1920s is quite ironic, for Yuan Bingling shows in her study of the ledgers of the Chinese Council of Batavia, documenting the legal proceedings of this Chinese community in what is now Jakarta, provides evidence that as early as the 17th century, the condition of women in Java were actually much better than their sisters in mainland China. However, Claudine Salmon, Yuan's mentor actually, also observes that by the late 19th century, the Chinese women of Java had lagged in terms of gender equality and civil rights for women compared to their counterparts in mainland China, let alone the women in the West, for example, as also lamented by Kartini in her letters to her counterpart in the Netherlands, Stella de Handelaar. As we have mentioned earlier, Han argues that women must liberate themselves not only for their own benefit, but also that the benefit of the nation, the Chinese nation, as their liberation would enable them to participate more actively in the social movement and the modernization of the Chinese nation, as has been exemplified in mainland China. Right before the article by Sin Pete about filial piety, or how, in the article explaining the purpose of the birth of Huapit, Chung Kuo Yin explains that the periodical is meant, meaning Huapit, is meant to foster the unity of the Chinese nation, both in the mainland and in the Indies and other diasporic communities. And while doing this, Chong also evokes the five-color flag of the Republic of China, which symbolizes the unity of the five races of China, or what is presumably the five races of China, namely the Han, the Mongols, the Manchus, the Tibetans, and the Hui, the Muslim Hui, as a part of the ideas promoted by the Xinhai Revolution of 1911. However, by the mid-1930s, when Penghibur, the periodical, appeared to the reading public, the sentiments showing affinity to the Chinese of the mainland and the social movements thereof seems to have somewhat diminished and disappeared. In these short anecdotal pieces in Penghibur, it is apparent how the Chinese and Indonesian identities merge, as both are opposed to the West. In the first piece, the Chinese are mocked for their lack of respect of the dead in comparison to the respect shown by the English, John Bull, the article mentions. Meanwhile, in the second piece, American celebrities are made fun of, are being mocked for having the habit of putting on too much makeup, as opposed to Indonesian actresses such as Suratna and the famous Fifi Yang of the Dardanella Theatre Company, who had also succeeded in making her way to Hollywood in her career. Elizabeth Chandra, in her study of the works of Nyo Cheng Sang, the author of the detective thriller series Gagak Lodra, mentions, referring to the authority of Professor Leo Suryadinata, that there had been in the 1920s and 30s a kind of split views on nationalism among the public figures in the Chinese community in the Indies. The earliest sentiments observable were those as represented in the writings in Huapo and Huapit in the 1920s, which viewed themselves as belonging to the nation fighting for liberation and social change in the mainland, including the intellectuals which revolved around the newspaper Sinpo, which, ironically enough, later was to be the first periodical to publish the words to the Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya. They were also groups which supported groups in the Chinese community which supported the preservation of Dutch colonial rule. However, then in the 1930s, another group also emerged which saw the Chinese community as having the obligation, or at least they're encouraged to participate and support the Indonesian nationalist movement and become part of the Indonesian national movement rather than the Chinese nationalist movement in the mainland and in Taiwan. Thus, the issue of gender equality must also be seen as a part of this problematic configuration of ambivalent nationalisms, as then the feminisms of the 1920s and the 1930s. The first wave in the Indies must position itself in a variety of patriarchal hegemonies. I have also on a previous occasion shown that the writing that appears in the first issue of Panghibur, published in January 1st, 1935, demonstrates a cosmopolitan mindset, a cosmopolitan worldview, not particularly showing any kind of nationalistic sentiment, Chinese or Indonesian, but rather shows the social life of people in a globalized world, linked to different geographical areas and localities via a network facilitated mainly by transportation, of course, transportation systems, and the worldwide publishing industry, considering that the publishing industry in the early 20th century had a far-reaching market. Thus, in viewing this problematic condition, the ethnic Chinese women in the Indies, we must apply the concept of intersectionality, which becomes crucial as the issue of gender, especially outside the West, in a multicultural post-colonial societies, is inevitably linked to the issues of race and class as well. This idea of intersectionality stems from concepts proposed by Chandra Talpade Mohanty and Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, to name just two influential proponents of intersectionality in feminist studies. As such, the social problems confronting the Chinese woman in the Indies, as represented in the writings of Hua Po, Hua Pit, and Penghibur, may be viewed as a kind of third wave feminist discourse in the era of first wave feminism. Further and more in-depth study of this, we believe, will show how such periodicals by Chinese Indonesian publishers have ushered not only the Chinese community, but the whole Indonesian society into the modern civilization, into modernity, and unfortunately also the problems entailing. Thank you so much for listening.